Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank
you for the opportunity to brief the Security Council on the Secretary General's report on South Sudan, as well as on the peace process and the situation on the ground. We are encouraged to report that since the signing of the revitalized peace agreement, there has been a significant improvement in the general security situation of the country, and incidents between signatory parties have reduced. Commanders on the ground have reached out to one another with and without the facilitation of the United Nations, and confidence-building measures have been initiated. This has led to the reopening of roads, free movement of civilians, movement of government and opposition groups in areas controlled by each other, and the beginning of the return of some displaced populations to their areas of origin. In Upper Nile, routes between Malakal and Rank and from Fangak to Tonga have been reopened. According to humanitarian partners in Bunch, which is in Mahang County, South Sudan People's Defense Forces, SSPDF, formerly the SPLA, met with their pro-Machar SPLA-IO counterparts in Benashowa and agreed to work together to ensure unhindered movement of civilians in their respective areas of control. Similar arrangements were also agreed in a trilateral arrangement with the pro-Lamakol National Democratic Alliance in their area. In Jonglei, as a result of similar meetings between the parties, there are reports that trade resumed from Ayot to Canal and from Wo to Pagong and Mogok. In central Equatoria, an UNMISS patrol to Magbo and Morobo in Yai River area observed the return of populations from refugee camps to both places. In Greater Bahr el Ghazal, local state authorities in Rajatown allowed opposition fighters to return, visit their families, and interact with local authorities. On the 8th of December, after negotiations between SSPDF and pro-Machar forces in Greater Bagari, road corridors between Wo Town and Greater Bagari were formally opened. Despite these positive developments, sporadic clashes did also take place, indicating that the improvements remained fragile. Between the 4th and the 6th of December, the pro-Tabandeng aligned forces allegedly carried out an attack on pro-Machar forces in Bil, Git County. And that attack resulted in 21 casualties. There are reports of fightings between the SSPDF and the non-signatory groups. The non-signatory group, National Salvation Front, in the Yei Amadi area. We also have serious concerns about the attacks against civilians that continue unabated. More rape cases were reporting following the abhorrent incidents of rape and sexual assault in areas along Nyaldiu and Git Road near Bentiu. Intercommunal violence as well as criminality continue to affect the civilian population in general, and women and children in particular, the latter being the most vulnerable amongst civilians. With regard to the horrific rapes in Bentiu, UNMISS proactively held urgent meetings with authorities and urged them to take immediate action to protect women and girls in the area and to hold the perpetrators of these terrible crimes to account. UNMISS peacekeepers have immediately sent patrols to the area to provide a protective presence, and UNMISS human rights team has launched an investigation to identify the perpetrators. UNMISS engineers are also clearing foliage from the sides of the road so attackers find it harder to conceal their presence. The mission has also been urging armed forces in the area to guarantee command and control over their troops to ensure rogue elements within their ranks are not involved in these criminal acts. The humanitarian situation in the country remains of grave concern and is a direct consequence of the conflict. Attacks on humanitarian workers, the dangers posed to them, and the impediments created by the parties to the conflict are unacceptable. We remain deeply concerned about the 2 UNMISS staff members arrested in 2014, whose whereabouts remain unknown. It is incumbent upon all parties, particularly the government, to ensure a safer and more conducive environment for humanitarian workers who work tirelessly to deliver assistance to the most vulnerable of South Sudanese civilians. Mr. President, we condemn in the strongest terms the continued prevalence of sexual violence, of which the recent attacks in Unity are a stark reminder. Such brutality is indefensible, and the parties must spare no efforts in bringing to justice all those who were responsible for these atrocities. There cannot be meaningful peace without an end to and accountability for the brutalizing of innocent civilians. However, This is an issue on which the international community must also continue to pronounce itself and remind the parties that with such prevalent impunity, South Sudan would not be able to find the place that it deserves among the community of nations. The responsibility to sustain the momentum in the implementation of the agreement lies solely with the parties. The positivity generated by the return of many of the committees and commissions to Juba, including opposition personnel, is mitigated by their delays and the lack of substantive discussion so far. The National Pre-Transitional Committee, NPTC, the highest level implementation committee, has met, but most recently failed to achieve a quorum. The Independent Boundary Commission, which is charged with settling the critical issue of state boundaries and subsequent implementation of the agreement within them during the transition period, is yet to meet, although the Technical Boundary Commission did meet in Juba and discussed modalities before adjourning for the year. The security-related committees have made little visible progress, with discussions mainly focusing on cantonment of military forces, their sustainment, and the subsequent reintegration process, rather than a more holistic approach to security sector reform, focusing on the requirements for a national army that is right-sized, affordable, depoliticized, and focused on preserving the territorial integrity of South Sudan against external threats. They are expected to meet again this week in Juba, and it is nonetheless encouraging that over the past weekend, some representatives of SPLA-IO and the South Sudan Opposition Alliance are reported to have returned to Juba without force protection to participate in these meetings. The initial pessimism and outright rejection of national dialogue by the opposition has transitioned into cautious optimism since President Kiir stepped down as convener. The National Dialogue Steering Committee has advanced as an independent and a more credible and transparent mechanism. As a result, the opposition parties suspicious of the process have begun to indicate possible willingness to engage in proceedings. However, we should be under no illusion that participation of opposition groups in any subnational or community-level dialogue remains largely contingent upon the prospects they see for themselves within the implementation of the peace agreement at the national level. It is essential that the parties continue building confidence and show the political will to work together to ensure a protective and inclusive environment that will allow all South Sudanese stakeholders, including civil society, women and youth, to meaningfully engage in the full implementation of the agreement. Mr. President, moving forward, we strongly believe there are two critical benchmarks that must be given top priority during the pre-transition period, which ends in May 2019. First, the parties must come to a comprehensive agreement on the security sector and on the establishment of transitional security arrangements. This is necessary to build confidence among the parties and ensure the return and permanent presence of all the opposition in Juba. A security agreement will be needed to be communicated within the ranks and to reassure the commanders and combatants about their future. Without these, the institutions of transition, even when established, are unlikely to be functional. Incidents are likely to occur and the peace process will remain fragile. I would like to encourage IGAD to prioritize the finalization of these negotiations, which the United Nations stands ready to support. Second, a new chair of the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, GMEC, also needs to be urgently appointed to shepherd these critical pre-transition negotiations and bring the architecture of the peace process to start substantive political preparations for the transition. We have been made aware of the IGAD Chiefs of Defense Forces proposal to increase the strength of the Regional Protection Force, RPF, to support the transitional security arrangements, which, as I mentioned, are yet to be agreed upon by the parties. The proposal recommends that Sudan, Uganda, Somalia, and Djibouti be added as troop-contributing countries to the UNMISS RPF. We have taken note of this proposal, which we understand will soon be communicated to the Security Council. On this issue, I would like to stress that the United Nations continue to commend the active role of the countries of the region, IGAD and the AU, which made possible the conclusion of the revitalized peace agreement. And we are fully committed to support its implementation as required and mandated by this Council. With regards to a possible reconfiguration of the UNMISS military component, I would like to reiterate some of the principles that we currently uphold with respect to all of our peacekeeping operations. First, the reconfiguration of UNMISS to support the transition must be preceded by the finalization of the agreement on transitional security arrangements, including a clear definition of the tasks that UNMISS would need to perform, which will then allow us to identify the capabilities required, their strength, and possible additional resources needed by the mission. The RPF is a constituent part of UNMISS, and we will have to consider the totality of the force requirements for its tasking. Second, unity of command within all Blue Helmets cannot be compromised. There can only be one UNMISS force to implement the mission's mandate and one chain of command for this force. 3, as a UN force mandated by the Security Council, all future TCCs to be considered must satisfy UN standards in terms of training, equipment, human rights vetting, and political neutrality and impartiality. And then last but certainly not least, in light of the dire humanitarian situation and continued plight of civilians, additional tasks that UNMISS could be asked to perform to support the peace process should not be at the operational or political cost of performing its protection functions, which remain absolutely essential in the current environment. In this regard, UNMISS will need to continue to dedicate adequate resources to its protection tasks to fully implement its mandate. Mr. President, in conclusion, as we find ourselves almost to the day exactly 5 years after the beginning of this conflict, I would like to reemphasize our key message to your Council here today. The chance for peace in South Sudan has been created. More progress has been made in the past 4 months than in the previous 4 years. We need to acknowledge this new political reality and commend both the parties, IGAD, and the region for their efforts and achievement. Nonetheless, the peace process is not yet assessed as fully sustainable and irreversible, and will need positive engagement and compromise from the parties and continued reinforcement if it is to deliver genuine hope and relief to the suffering South Sudanese populations. I also need to reiterate the imperative for IGAD and the African Union to continue their efforts in support of the peace process and reconfirm the commitment of the United Nations to assist their efforts. And I thank you, Mr. President.